Right. All good. Well, kia ora koutou everybody. You heard my introductory remarks in there before, so I won't repeat them all out here for you unless you want me to. So happy to get into questions.
Prime Minister, you might have seen the IPCA report of the Wellington riot. It talked about how some of your ministers were venting Commissioner Costa. How is that different from what Stuart Nash doing?
I found that there was no improper political pressure exerted on the police commissioner. There's been an independent report now that's verified that. The speaker, that was ultimately a meeting of the speaker. There were some ministers who were in the room at the time, but it was ultimately the speaker's instigation, that meeting. He is the occupier of Parliament, so he is the legal occupier, or was the legal occupier of Parliament. So it's appropriate. If you've got someone setting up camp on your front lawn, it's appropriate for the person concerned, or the entity concerned, to be communicating with the police about that.
And the Parliamentary Service deleted some of the footage that could have been used in this IPCA investigation. Are you concerned that they did that?
I haven't had a chance to have a look at that, but obviously, I'd expect them to have, to be pretty careful around those sorts of things.
The National Party says today's inflation numbers show cost of living crisis is just business as normal for the Labour government. Do you agree that we should stick in for more inflation?
Well, it sounds to me like they drafted that up before they saw what their numbers actually were. The numbers have come out significantly better than most economic forecasters, including most of the banks, were suggesting. We're not out of the woods yet though, but it is an encouraging sign that we're coming off the peak and the inflation numbers are heading back down. When you look at areas where we're still seeing inflationary pressure, things like fresh fruit and vegetables, well, clearly the weather has had an impact there on the prices that New Zealanders are paying for that. We've seen a bit of a spike in second-hand cars. Again, the cyclone will have had a bit to do with that. People who lost their cars during flood and cyclone damage, that'll be contributing to pressure in those areas. And of course, building and construction remains a challenging area for us in terms of inflation.
Prime Minister, what actions will they be taking in response to the IPCA report?
We will consider it fully. Obviously, the IPCA report has highlighted some concerns that the police have around issues where there are these sort of public disorder events. I believe the report refers to them as. We have to tread carefully in that area, though. The case law around this, and I was one of the people involved in, around has been established over a long period of time, and I think before we did anything to unwind any of that, the right to protest is pretty fundamental in a democracy. That doesn't mean we should agree with it. I think everyone would agree that the parliamentary protest, particularly towards the end, stepped well and truly outside the bounds of what would be, acceptable forms of protest. When you've got protesters hurling bricks at police and so on, that's utterly unacceptable. But we just need to be careful that we don't upset the balance and therefore prevent people being able to exercise their democratic right, and that includes to protest.
On emissions reduction,
yes.
Should the government have intervened to stop New Zealand Steel getting consents for another 25 years of emissions, because the minister involved could have intervened supervised?
I'm going to hand you over to the Minister for Energy on that one.
Thank you. In terms of how it is that we decarbonise, we have to make sure that we're not deindustrialising as well, that we have to be looking at ways in which we can work with our industrial users. We need to look at ways in which they can decarbonise. So in terms of the decision that Minister Parker made, in terms of the consent and the renewal of the consent, that's obviously a conversation that you'll have with Minister Parker. But I know as the Minister of Energy and Resources, what I am absolutely committed to is making sure that we're working in partnership with industry to make sure that we can continue to have an industrial sector in New Zealand, but that is consistent with our decarbonisation pathways.
And you announced earlier today that there will be a national policy statement to direct councils to speed up consenting for renewable electricity. There's already 2 gigawatts of consented power projects there, which you control have for a decade not invested because they're trying to generate higher profits and dividends for shareholders like yourself. Why don't you just get the gentailers to use the consents they've got.
Because we're going to need far more than is already consented, Bernard, that we are actually going to have to also make pathways for independent generators, and I think that's going to be an incredibly important part of the future landscape, that whether it be with solar array, whether it be onshore wind or indeed offshore wind, where we're looking at developing the regulatory regime. We need to make sure that we've got consistency nationally, and that's one of the things that the national direction will give. Of course, that we are looking also through our RMA reforms to making sure that we are cutting the red tape, and this alongside it will make sure that occurs. One of the things that we're not doing, unlike the National Party opposition, is going out and saying that we should say people can sit on their consents for 35 years. We're very much of a lose it or use it mentality. We don't want to see people essentially land banking to shut out competitors, because we must see new generation coming in.
Because Genesis has just decided to cut down the size of the wind farm that it had been planning for 10 years to a third of what was originally consented, because it says it wants to make more profit.
I think one of the most interesting things we're seeing in our energy sector at the moment is a real shift. And the only game in town is no longer our gentailers in terms of investing in generation. We are seeing significant investments coming in from independent generators as well, who are using mechanisms like power purchase agreements to on-sell what they are generating. So I think we are seeing some fundamental shifts in front of us, that I'm interested in what we can do to ensure that we are seeing more of that independent generation, but also what we're doing through this national direction is ensuring that we've got really smooth pathways for community-based schemes.
Just on that, with the energy hat on and the GIDI fund,
Mm-hmm.
was used here, are you concerned that with the failure of the emissions trading scheme auction a few weeks ago, and the advice from the Climate Commission that your revenues could drop millions because of that you won't have enough money for the likes of the GIDI fund to invest in this sort of decarbonisation?
Well, we've already committed $650 million to the next round, the next phase of GIDI, $1 billion actually, if you stretch that over a longer period of time. But for us as a government, GIDI represents incredibly savvy economics, that what we're seeing, for example, with this project is the cost of reducing carbon, a tonne of carbon is $25. If we did nothing, as some are suggesting, we would be forced to go out there and pay another country in the form of an international credit, maybe as much as $150 a tonne, to offset that carbon emission. So as a government, this presents an incredibly compelling business proposition for us as well. So no, I'm not concerned.
And on the climate change issue, I'd like to ask the Prime Minister, because you announced some changes on the climate change policy going forward. Aren't you concerned that the government is not taking the advice from the Climate Commission on the likes of the emissions trading scheme and carbon forests, and that you are risking creating a liability, Treasury says could be $24 billion by not reducing emissions faster?
The government set out our emissions reductions budgets, Bernard, and we're absolutely committed to meeting those. The only significant reprioritisation decision that we've taken that has an impact on those emissions reduction budgets is around the removal of the biofuels mandate. We've already been able to recoup some of the net, or the emissions that we're not reducing through biofuels. We've already been able to offset some of that with a higher uptake of electric vehicles, so significantly higher than we had anticipated. And there are other ways that we'll be able to offset that as well. So we're still committed to those budgets.
Just going back to that
Yeah.
PCA report, it found that the laws are lacking around mass release. Is that something you want to change urgently?
I think again it's an area where we have to tread with caution. I think the idea that people can be arrested en masse at a protest is something that I think we should take some time to consider. As someone who was arrested en masse at a protest once, where the courts then determined that that was an unlawful arrest, I think that highlights the fact that we need to be careful.
Is there scope to increase police funding to ensure that there is
This government has significantly increased police resourcing in the time we've been in office. We're on track to hit our goal by the middle of this year of having 1,800 extra police on the beat. And that sits alongside a significant investment in the resources that support those police, including improving their communication rolling out at the moment, and training for frontline police, because it's not just about having the people, it's also about making sure that they're up to date with their training so that they can do the job as effectively as possible.
Should they have done more to prevent the occupation in the first place?
Look, one of the reasons that we have a review process, and the IPCA have looked at this thoroughly, is so that they can capture the lessons learned, and I'm confident that they've done that.
Was Trevor Mallard right to use music and sprinklers on the protesters at Parliament?
Ultimately, over whether that was the right approach or not. Clearly the IPCA have made some observations about that. Ultimately now it's a matter for the public to judge. There's not a lot that we can do going backwards now, we've got to look forwards.
Are you concerned about the $2 billion budget hole that's there now because of the failure of the emissions trading scheme as advised by the Climate Commission? How are you going to deal with that?
Look, as I've indicated, we're still committed to the emissions reductions budgets that we have. There are a variety of different ways that we can achieve those goals. What you will have seen today is further evidence of areas where the government can do more. We know that the government investment in decarbonising industry, for example, can have a really tangible impact on a co-investment basis. So it's not just the government chipping in there, but business as well. And so we continue to look for how we can reduce our emissions as quickly and as efficiently and as cost effectively as possible.
So would you like Chelsea to electrify its boilers, which are actually producing 90% of the emissions, it's only reduced 10%?
Yeah, we actually had a conversation about that when we were walking their look to do before they do that is make sure that they're using their fuel as efficiently as possible. So if you're switching, for example, from a gas boiler to electricity, you want to make sure that the systems are as efficient as possible before you do that. So I think that the sorts of investments that we've seen here are good precursors to a more sustainable energy future for companies like this.
Yeah. Particularly then IPCA report kind of shows that in all areas, more corrections police, we weren't really ready for that sort of anger, that sort of protest. Do you think in the future we should be looking at what to do if that will happen again? Do you think this will happen again?
I think we have to acknowledge that some of the things that we've seen internationally in recent in New Zealand, and so the sort of protest methods, for example, convoys of cars blocking main arterial routes and so on, that hasn't really been a feature of protest in New Zealand in the past, but clearly the parliamentary protest was a bit of a sign that actually those things that have happened around the rest of the world we're not immune from here in New Zealand. And so the IPCA report, I think, gives us a good base to consider some of those issues and to make sure that we are providing the police as much support as they need to be able to deal with those things as effectively as possible.
Talking about the parliamentary process, should the former Prime Minister engage with protesters? Would you have
No, I wouldn't have, and I certainly wouldn't have expected Jacinda Ardern to engage with them either. I got a pretty good view of the parliamentary protest out of my office window, and at various points saw some of the symbols there that suggest that engaging with that mob would have been an unsafe thing to do. At one point there was a noose hanging from a tree. I don't think that any responsible political leader would be engaging with people exhibiting those sorts of behaviours.
just on inflation, how would you describe the impact it's having on Kiwi households?
There's no question that inflation is really biting into Kiwi household budgets. It's one of the reasons why the government's put cost of living at the forefront of what we're doing. You'll see it at the forefront of the budget decisions that we've taken when the budget's released in about a month's time. We know that it's a difficult time for New Zealand families. We want to support New Zealanders through that, and we also want to see inflation getting back down to more of into the Reserve Bank's target range. That's not going to happen overnight, but clearly these most recent quarterly numbers are an encouraging sign that inflation is starting to point in the right direction.
drama around National Tairi candidate.
That's really a matter for the National Party.
Do you think they're able to choose proper MPs?
That's really a matter for them. I mean, there's a million reasons not to vote for National, but we won't get into that today.
Just on sugar,
Yes.
one way to reduce demand, why not put out a sugar tax to reduce the amount of...
I've just won a bet, Bernard, that coming to a Chelsea sugar factory that I would get asked by you about whether we should have a sugar tax or not. So thank you for that. I think my payoff will be a cake when we go back in there later on. It's not something that we're looking at.
Taking it back to the protests, are you satisfied that there's no political influence?
Yes, I am. And I think the IPCA report bears that out as well. All right. Thanks very much, everybody. Cheers.
Thank you.